I'm going to walk you through a landscape painting I did based on Arrowtown in New Zealand. It's quite a tricky subject with all the leaves, grass, rocks, reflections, and other details. It's also a bit of an unusual composition with the slightly downward perspective and the sky cropped out. Now before I get into it, I just want to let you know about a resource package I put together for you that goes along with this video. It includes the reference photo, a photo of the finished painting, progress shots, and several landscape painting PDFs. I'll put a link to it in the description below the video. I start by staining the surface with transparent oxide red. This kills the white and provides a more balanced surface to paint on. Then I use paper towel to roughly map out the composition by lifting paint from the lighter areas. I start working on the background and try to get a feel for the subject. I don't have a firm plan for this painting, so I'm just jumping straight into it and seeing where the brush takes me. I map out a few of the light colours around the shoreline. These are important marks as they establish where the river will go. I don't want to paint the river just yet, but I can paint the surroundings to establish its position in the painting. The land at the bottom provides good opportunities for injecting a bit of colour and variance. I use multicoloured strokes here to capture the detail without having to do that much work. To paint these strokes, I basically just pick up a few different colours with my brush and leave them partially unmixed. I then make a confident stroke on the surface. The result is a streaky, multicoloured stroke that can convey a lot of information about the subject. The downside of this technique is it's unpredictable. There's no way I can know for sure what's going to happen when I pick up a few colours and place them on the surface. I'm relying a lot on instinct rather than calculated thought. Sometimes this works out and sometimes it doesn't, but the early stages of a painting is a good time to try. It's also a good technique for background or foreground areas like this, where you can get away with being a bit more abstract in your approach. If I were painting an intricate focal point, I probably wouldn't use this technique, at least not in such an aggressive way. Instead, I'd use techniques which give me a bit more control over what I'm doing. I work my way up through the ground on the left-hand side. I use lighter and weaker oranges, browns, and yellows in this area. I also use more repetitive and directional brushwork that follows the general flow and the contours of the landscape. I do a similar thing for the ground at the back. I just use slightly lighter colours. I also add a touch of magenta to pick up some of those reddish tones that I see in the reference photo. I start working on the dark accents. These are fairly warm in nature, as they mostly represent dirt and rocks and fallen autumn leaves. I rely on magenta and alizarin crimson for these areas, but the colour itself doesn't matter that much. What I'm most interested in is getting the value and general temperature right. These areas need to be dark enough and warm enough. Everything else is fair game. I also need to account for the photo likely being underexposed in these dark areas. That is, they are too dark compared to what you would see in life. So given this, I don't mind if I go a little bit lighter with the dark areas in my painting. I transition to the water. It seems like the logical next step to go from the dark accents on the left to the dark parts of the water on the right. I use more ultramarine blue here. This is a dark blue that is slightly warm compared to most other blues, meaning it leans towards red on the colour wheel. The water is actually made up of a few different parts. There are the dark, shallow parts, the main body of the river, and this area of glassy water in the front, which is reflecting some of the sky colours. I need to adopt a different approach to suit each area. For the dark, shallow area I'm working on here, I continue the short, punchy strokes that I've been using for the other areas. I just weave in a few more dark blues, reds, and earth tones to suggest water, reflections, and the rocks and sand on the riverbed. For the main body of water, there's much more movement in the water as it flows to the left-hand side. I use my strokes to convey this sense of movement and flow. For the colour, it's a bit of a bluish-grey colour around the middle of the value scale in terms of lightness. Notice how I'm using less paint with these strokes. That's because I'm not completely sure on the colour for this area, and I want to see what it looks like before I really commit. I go around and make this dark part of the water just a bit darker. The idea is that these dark colours will act as a point of contrast for the light reflection colours, so I need them to be dark enough so that the reflections really pop and have that crisp appearance. I'm quite happy with how that weak blue colour looks for the main body of the river, so I'll go ahead and block in that area. I'm still thinking about the nature and the movement of the water as I make my strokes. I use shorter strokes here to suggest areas where the water's a bit broken and turbulent. And I use longer, smoother strokes to suggest the broad sense of movement and flow. Now it's time to start bringing in a bit more lightened colour with the crisp blue reflections. My strategy for this area is to block it in as a solid blue mass and then paint the tree reflections and fallen leaves over the top. For the colour, I'm using mostly cobalt blue and titanium white. I also use a bit of ultramarine blue for the darker areas. I'm keeping my brushwork fairly simple and flat, as I want to play into the idea of calm, glassy water. I'm also making sure to pick up that soft colour gradation between the different blues. I go back to multicoloured strokes and broken colour for this area of grass on the left-hand side. I also use a few flat strokes of colour to suggest more simple areas of grass. These simple areas are quite important for giving our eyes a rest. I don't want to get too fancy with the brushwork, otherwise it will just appear overdone and too noisy. Now I pick up some of the light orange colour that I was using earlier and weave it into the greens. I want these areas to somewhat melt into each other. I don't want the grass to appear too distinct from the rocks and the dirt and the sand. One benefit of working wet on wet with oil paints is that it allows me to easily work these colours together to create some interesting effects and colours. It also allows me to soften the edge between the grass and the rocky surface. The more strokes I make on the surface, the more the colours mix together and create an intermediate colour. For the background area, I go ahead and block it all in with weak blues and greens using a palette knife. The palette knife is effective here because it forces me to keep it simple. With a brush, I might be tempted to get lost in the tiny details. The main thing I'm trying to pick up at the moment is the subtle colour gradation from pale green at the top to dark blue at the bottom. The colours also get a bit lighter as we move towards the right-hand side. I'm approaching this area like I did the water at the front. I'm blocking it all in with colour, then I'll go over the top with more intricate details later on. This seems less tedious than trying to paint it all at once. I work my way down and block in the rest of the land with colour. There's a bit going on in this area. There are several green plants, the ground is covered with fallen leaves and has subtle shifts in colour, and there's a bit of a hill on the right-hand side. I want to convey all this as simply as I can. I keep using a palette knife here as I want to stay fairly abstract in my approach. I can always add the finer details later. For now, I just want to lay in the big, simple shapes and colours. I go around and add a bit more contrast by making the ground a touch lighter and the dark parts of the water a touch darker. For the lights, I'm just scumbling light colours over the top rather than painting over it completely. The scumbled colours do a good job of conveying flickering highlights and all the other details on the ground. For the dark areas, I use more solid brushwork as I want these areas to appear flatter and more ambiguous. The colour I'm using here is basically just a dark and slightly warm grey. You can see here I'm starting to paint in the main part of the reflected tree. I'm not trying to copy it exactly as I see it in the reference photo, rather I'm just trying to capture the broad feel and structure of it. The water at the front is a bit dark at the moment, so I go over it with lighter and crisper colours. I use a palette knife again here as I want to keep the paint thin, and I also want to cover the area quickly. You can see already that this colour looks much more appropriate. It has that nice sharp and crisp appearance that was lacking before. Now I still have about 6 hours of painting footage here, and I'm already 10 minutes into this video, so instead of trying to rush through the rest, I'll break it into 2 parts. Otherwise, this is going to take far too long. This will be part 1, and I'll publish part 2 in a week or so. Thanks so much for watching.